Okay, we are ready to start. Artemis, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the fifth Zoom lecture of this semester in the framework of the 56th public lecture series celebrating 30 years of research at the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus. I'm most delighted to welcome and introduce our tonight's speaker, Dr. Artemis Georgiou, currently Assistant Research Professor at the ARU. Artemis has a special bond with the unit and the Department of History and Archaeology. She graduated from our department in 2005, while she has been a postdoctoral researcher and close collaborator of the unit since 2013. More importantly, Artemis recently won a most prestigious grant, a European Research Council starting grant, honoring the ARU with hosting the first ERC project in archaeology in the Republic of Cyprus and in the still young University of Cyprus. Thank you and congratulations, Artemis. Artemis Georgiou specializes in the study of the political, economic, and social landscape of Cyprus during the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BC, and has a special interest in the ceramic production of Cyprus, Greece, and the Levant, as well as in the international connections maintained by the Eastern Mediterranean communities during the prehistoric and protohistoric times. As I mentioned earlier, she completed her BA degree in History and Archaeology at the University of Cyprus and continued with her master's studies and doctoral research at the University of Oxford. In 2013, she defended her PhD thesis titled The Settlement Histories of Cyprus in the 12th Century BC, which she completed under the supervision of Professor Irini Lemos. During her postgraduate studies, she received several scholarships and grants, such as from the AG Leventis Foundation, the UK Greek Archaeological Committee, and others. Following the completion of her doctoral degree and upon her return to her island, Dr. Georgiou received the postdoctoral fellowship for the research project with the acronym ARIEL, or Archaeological Investigations of the Extra-Urban and Urban Landscape in Eastern Mediterranean Centers, a case study at Pila-Kouremenos, funded by the Marie Curie Actions. The program was implemented at the ARU between the years 2013 to 2017 in collaboration with our colleague, Professor Maria Iakovou. In the following year, she secured a postdoctoral fellowship within the University of Cyprus internal grant scheme, and during 2020 to 2021, she was the Edgar Pettenberg Postdoctoral Fellow for Cypriot Prehistory at the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute. Artemis Georgiou participated in a number of archaeological field projects in Cyprus and Greece. In recent years, she has been collaborating with several missions for the study of pottery, such as the Pala-Kouremenos Urban Landscape Project, the Kalavassos and Maroni Built Environment Project, the French mission at Kition, as well as the University of Oxford's field project at Lefkandi Xeropolis, the Athens Archaeological Committee's excavations at the East House of Mycenae, and the Lower Acropolis of Hazor in Israel. Dr. Georgiou has been particularly busy in publishing the results of her independent research and collective field and pottery studies, field and study projects. At the moment, she is working jointly with Professor Iakovou on the data and results of the long-running Pala-Kouremenos Urban Landscape Project to be published with Ostrom Editions. Artemis has also co-edited or edited 3 specialized volumes and has published more than 30 papers in journals, collective volumes, and encyclopedias. She has also been teaching assistant at the University of Cyprus, the French School at Athens, and the University of Oxford. Since June 2021, Dr. Georgiou has been assistant research professor at the ARU and the principal investigator of the research project COMPASS, a European Research Council starting grant, which aims at investigating the interregional and intercultural connectivity in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze and the Early Iron Age, about which we are going to hear more in today's public lecture. Before giving our virtual floor to Artemis, I would like to remind you of our special event starting tomorrow and lasting until Thursday, the 28th of October. It is Convivium I refer to, the international conference in honor of Professor Emeritus Dimitrios Michailidis, celebrating his 75th birthday tomorrow and his past and ongoing invaluable contribution to the archaeology and cultural heritage of Cyprus and the Mediterranean. You are invited to attend virtually via Zoom by registering first. Please refer to the webpage of the conference by clicking on the link that I will now provide on the chat here on Zoom. And finally, I would like to remind you to switch off your cameras and mute your microphones during our speaker's presentation, and use the chat section to type your question or comments to our speaker today. Thank you very much. Artemis, off to you.
Thank you, Thanasis. Thank you for this very generous introduction and your kind words as always. Before I share my screen, please allow me to just share with you that the Archaeological Research Unit has been my academic home for 20 years now, since 2001, when I first entered the department as an undergraduate student. And it is very emotional for me to contribute to the unit's lecture series, this time as an ERC grantee. And I say this while I share my screen. And I must confess that this overwhelming achievement would not have been possible without the contribution of the people of the ARU, both the established professors, but also the very vibrant community of the younger generation of Cypriot archaeologists. And I take this opportunity to thank all the ARU members who generously shared their expertise throughout the preparation of my application, my ERC application, and to all the academic members of the Department of History and Archaeology for their support following the securing of the grant. And I'm especially thankful to you, Thanasis, Thanasis in his capacity as the director of the ARU dedicated a lot of his time and energy in making sense of administrative technicalities to ensure the effective implementation of this ERC grant at the University of Cyprus. In my presentation today, I intend to explore the intricate topic of interregional connectivity in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and into the earliest phases of the Iron Age. As already mentioned, my lecture will present and discuss the contribution of a new large-scale project which has just been established at the Archaeological Research Unit. At this point, I would like to apologize in advance that the discussion will, for the most part, be of preliminary nature, considering that the project has just been implemented, but I hope that you will share my enthusiasm for this topic, and I would be eager to discuss the manifold aspects I will raise. In addressing ancient maritime commerce, shipwrecks are appreciated as windows opening up to provide generous insights into the interregional trading strategies and intercultural connectivity characterizing past societies. In the context of the Late Bronze Age Mediterranean, the most impressive remains are without a doubt those of the ship that sank close to the Uluburun Cape during the final years of the 14th century BC. The Uluburun shipwreck literally encapsulates the international spirit of the Late Bronze Age and the magnitude of the interregional bark commerce, linking the sophisticated political authorities that dominated the Eastern Mediterranean in this period. The ship's cargo originated from various regions, carrying an impressive array of raw materials, high-end finished products, and a plethora of other commodities. Its primary freight was metals, no less than 10 tons of copper, consistent with Cypriot sources, and 1 ton of tin. Seaborne trade in the Late Bronze Age was undoubtedly diverse, complex, and multidimensional, largely dominated by state-level control, but also allowing for small-scale entrepreneurial ventures. As the chief provider of the bronze-making metal of copper, Cyprus was an integral player in this scheme. As evidenced by the Uluburun cargo, the island's communities were able to provide tons of copper for a single shipload, and we can only speculate as to the number of such ships sailing the Mediterranean on a yearly basis, as more and more of such instances are being brought to light. The Uluburun shipwreck substantiates the type of trade illustrated in the roughly contemporary Amarna letters, which record the correspondence between the Egyptian pharaoh and other royalties, including the king of Al-Ashia, a place name almost unanimously identified as Cyprus, designated as a supplier of copper. The excavation of the Uluburun shipwreck provides substantial information on the interregional commercial strategies in the Mediterranean during what has been referred to as the Age of Internationalism. However, we find ourselves dazzled by the sheer quantities of metals on board that we often overlook the second largest consignment of the ship, that is the 150 transport containers neatly stacked inside the ship's hull, or rather the perishable commodities that were contained within these jars. Indeed, archaeological, textual, and iconographic evidence articulate how Mediterranean overseas trade of the second and first millennium BC, alongside raw materials and high-status artifacts, was also characterized by the circulation of perishable goods. The demand for wine and oil in particular has been linked to the significance of feasting activities as ideological expressions of high social status within communities. The need to contain liquid commodities within solid media for their bulk seaborne transshipment resulted in the emergence of a specialized ceramic class of containers defined as maritime transport containers in a recent publication by Bernard Knapp and Stella Domestica. In other words, these ceramic vessels, found by the hundreds across the Mediterranean, were circulating not to be consumed as ceramic vessels per se, but in the name of their contents. Since the commodities are by and large not preserved in the archaeological record, these inorganic ceramic proxies remain the only contributors to our understanding of the scale and nature of the specific type of ancient seaborne trade. Commercial exchanges involving maritime transport containers are differentiated from those concerning smaller-sized ceramic closed vessels of finer quality, such as the Cypriot base ring or the Mycenaean stirrup jars. These fine wares, although again circulating extensively across the Mediterranean, are nonetheless associated with a different practice, that of micro-packaging of added value commodities, for instance, perfumed oils or psychoactive substances, etc. They are therefore distinguished from maritime transport containers, which were employed in the seaborne transshipment of commodities in bulk. In the temporal and geographical context of the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean, the maritime transport container par excellence is known in modern scholarship as the Canaanite jar, produced in various regions across the Levant. Their morphology is varied, but the shape is typified by a narrow opening, angular shoulders, a characteristically narrow base, and at least two short vertical handles. Seminal studies have distinguished the large corpus of Canaanite jars into numerous morphological categories. These correspond to the temporal evolution of several production centers across the Levant. Canaanite jars are found in variable quantities in sites along the Levantine coast, Cyprus and Egypt, reaching as far as Nubia in the south and Aegean in the west. In addition to the 150 Canaanite jars found on board the Uluburun, the 80 vessels found stacked inside a storeroom at one of Ugarit's ports epitomize the bulk production and circulation of these containers. As far as their contents are concerned, it appears that the vessels were employed for the transshipment of plenty of different commodities, predominantly wine, oil, and resins. Well over half of the Uluburun jars contained a yellowish substance that has been identified as resin, specifically terebinth resin, which has multiple uses in ancient times. Other Canaanite jars from the ship contained olives, and interestingly, one was filled with thousands of tiny glass beads. By the inception of the New Kingdom, transport containers emulating the form of Canaanite jars began being produced locally in Egypt. The so-called Egyptian jars share several of the features of the Canaanite amphorae, but are distinguished by their characteristic fused form or squat morphology, as well as their distinctive red color fabric. The commodity contained was predominantly wine, indicated by inked hieratic labels and inscriptions on their ceilings, such as on the several jars deposited inside the burial chamber of Tutankhamun. Egyptian sources are, as usual, very eloquent and even provide the name of the vintner. Compared to their Levantine counterparts, Egyptian jars had a much more confined distribution abroad. They have been found in the southern Levant, in Cyprus, and in much fewer quantities in Crete. Within the late Bronze Age southern Aegean, the preferred shape used in the long-distance transport of commodities was the transport stirrup jar. These vessels are easily distinguished from the more common finer stirrup jars in terms of the gritzy fabric and much larger size. Transport stirrup jars were decorated by linear bands or more rarely by octopus depictions. A small group bears short linear B inscriptions, most identifying personal names, a scheme possibly associated with gift exchange practices. Transport stirrup jars were produced in a number of different centers in the Aegean, but the majority are consistent with Cretan sources. They have been recovered in substantial quantities in sites along the Aegean and in smaller numbers in the Levant, Cyprus, Egypt, and southern Italy. These three distinctive classes of ceramic maritime transport containers are essentially the ancestors of the later ubiquitous transport amphorae of classical, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. Much like the better known later examples, these ceramic classes are valued as indispensable contributors to evaluating the character and intensity of the movement of goods across the Mediterranean. So what do we know about the circulation and consumption of these vessels from the island of Cyprus, which, as we have already established, was a key player in the intricate interregional commerce as the major provider of copper and has been widely referred to as the crossroads of Eastern Mediterranean? The answer is surprisingly little. When discussing ceramic imports in Cyprus, much ink has been spilled on imports from the West, particularly on Mycenaean finewares, whereas imports from the East, such as Canaanite and Egyptian jars, have received proportionally little attention. And in a way, this makes sense, as even the smallest body from a Mycenaean vessel is truly unambiguous, unlike the mundane fabrics of the commercial jars. Fragments of imported transport jars from early fieldwork projects were only rarely identified and were usually lumped with local cores and plain wares. The fact that the published material does not correspond to real numbers is evident by the detailed re-examination of older excavations. For example, the meticulous studies by Lindy Crew on the early late Bronze Age remains of Engomi and Galopsida, which have yielded much larger numbers than what had been previously assumed. A more realistic assessment of the material is also provided by the most recent publications, such as the exemplarily holistic study of the ceramic remains from Hala Sultan Tekke by Fischer and Berger, which provide indicatively substantial percentages for imported transport amphorae. Among the early works standing out is the pioneering study of the impressive numbers of Canaanite jars from the site of Ma Paleokastro by Maria Hadjigosti and her associates in the 1980s. The material from these assemblages was thoroughly investigated, and the petrographic and chemical provenance studies were truly cutting edge. In spite of this groundbreaking research, the integration of interdisciplinary methodologies for the study of transport containers from Cypriot contexts has been extremely sporadic. An astonishing observation with regards to the occurrence of transport amphorae in Cyprus is that in their vast majority, these imported vessels were found within post-1200 BC contexts. That is to say, the largest assemblages of Canaanite and Egyptian jars, and to a lesser degree of transport stirrup jars, deposited in Cypriot contexts, date to the period following the collapse of most of the political entities in the Mediterranean and the significant changes brought about in the level, intensity, and nature of interregional commerce during a period that is widely referred to as the crisis years. The dawn of the 12th century BC in the Eastern Mediterranean prompted a new dynamic economic system that favored entrepreneurship in smaller and regional spheres, employing smaller anchorages and involving informal exchange networks. It was during the post-crisis era that the Cypriots rose to the forefront of these decentralized commercial strategies, and throughout the early Iron Age, Cyprus was an important nexus for small-scale interregional commerce. During this era, Cypriot bronze continued to be traded, evidently in small weighted units and highly commoditized recycled metal, while Cypriot finewares continued to be exported to several sites in the Eastern Mediterranean. And indeed, a critical indicator of the uninterrupted trading connections between Cyprus and the rest of the Mediterranean in the post-crisis era are the significant numbers of imported transport containers deposited in the Cypriot context of this period. I have come to appreciate the potential of maritime transport containers in the study of ancient maritime trade and connectivity as a result of my own hands-on study of this material from the settlement of Pila-Kouremenos. This intriguing site was founded during the end of the 13th century BC atop a high-rising plateau in southeastern Cyprus and was exceptionally short-lived. During my participation in the archaeological mission conducted between the years 2010 and 11, an outstanding number of such jars was exposed, which was entrusted to me by Professor Vassos Karagiorgis and Athanasia Kanda, who directed the excavations and to whom I wish to express my gratitude. During the study of this material, I went through the entire corpus of excavated sherds and recorded more than 1,000 fragments of diagnostic and non-diagnostic Canaanite and Egyptian jars that correspond to at least 68 different vessels. These numbers concern the material from only these 2 excavation years, not including finds from the excavations conducted in the 1980s, nor by the ongoing fieldwork by the joint Belgian and Greek expedition, which are again producing prolific results. The vast majority of the maritime transport containers from Pila I examined are Canaanite jars with only a few fragmentarily preserved Egyptian jars. In typological terms, the predominant Canaanite jar type in the Pila assemblage falls within one of the 2 broad categories of this class, namely the so-called bellied amphora, which is characterized by relatively rounded shoulders. The more rarely attested 4-handled subcategory of the same form was also included in this corpus. The second broad category of Canaanite jars, namely the smaller sized angular shouldered form, was represented at Pila by a single example. The angular shouldered jars are in general extremely rare in Cyprus, and this is a significant point of reference. The angular shouldered Canaanite jar was the principal type employed in the maritime transshipment of goods during the most part of the Late Bronze Age. This is a type represented in the largest known assemblages like Uluburun. But in the periods following 1200 BC and the fragmentation of interregional commerce in the Mediterranean, the angular shoulder variant became much less popular, almost extinct. On the other hand, the production of the bellied Canaanite jar type was not impeded by the collapse of the globalized trade at around 1200 BC. This form continued well into the early Iron Age, and appears to be characteristic of commercial strategies in the post-crisis era. The dearth of the standardized angular-shouldered jars in Cyprus, which evidently typify commercial strategies during the age of internationalism, and the overwhelming quantities of the more varied belly-type jars is indicative of the participation of Cypriot communities within the distribution networks that were active in the post-crisis era. Beyond the typological studies, I also conducted macroscopic fabric analysis on the material of Canaanite and Egyptian jars from Pila-Kouremenos, which resulted in the identification of 27 different fabric groups that could potentially correspond to different production centers in the Levant, Egypt, and one possible candidate in Cyprus. The profusion of different fabrics at Pila is a vivid testimony of the vigorous engagement of this site in maritime trading activities. With this promising start in hand, and considering the lack of a contextual and holistic approach for the study of maritime transport containers from late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Cyprus, I took the challenge of putting together an application for a European Research Council starting grant. ERC grants are recognized as one of the EU's most competitive research funding schemes, and indeed my application was reviewed by 9 different evaluators and went through several evaluative stages before succeeding to secure funding. The project, with the acronym COMPASS, has just been implemented at the Archaeological Research Unit of the University of Cyprus, starting in June 2021, for a duration of 5 years, with a budget of around 1.25 million euros. A team of 7 associates will collaborate with me to implement the intriguing tasks of the proposed research. The overall objective is to provide new insights into the interregional commercial strategies that characterized ancient communities of the Eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, through the comprehensive and interdisciplinary study of maritime transport containers that were imported to Cyprus from the Levant, Egypt, and the Aegean. A number of case studies will be investigated within the frame of this project, and in order to extract meaningful data, the entire island will be approached on the basis of 8 geographical peripheries. The project's case studies include both primary and secondary centers, coastal and inland sites, as well as a variety of different contexts. In addition, the team will investigate the pertinent remains from selected sites in the Levant, with the aim of investigating the production of Canaanite jars and the reciprocity in Cypriot goods. The research project endorses a holistic approach in the study of maritime transport containers, and in the remaining time, I will briefly elaborate on the various interrelated research tasks. The project's primary task is to provide a thorough classification system for the 3 distinct classes of maritime transport containers from the Cypriot context, and to establish the subcategories within each distinctive class. This will be achieved through a meticulous hands-on recording of old and new archaeological assemblages, which will entail the critical baseline for the implementation of the project's more ambitious objectives. As a ceramic specialist, I will take charge of most of these hands-on tasks in collaboration with the excavators of each case study. In addition, a postdoctoral research associate will contribute with the study of the assemblages dating to the early Iron Age from selected promising contexts such as Gideon, Amathus, and Palepaphos. The second large-scale objective is the designation of provenance. This will be achieved by means of an integrated analytical scheme based on, first of all, the macroscopic visual inspection of different fabrics to distinguish discrete groups, the extensive scanning through a portable XRF, thin section ceramic petrography on a representative subset to document compositional variability, and finally, the integration of instrumental neutron activation analysis to be undertaken at the Archaeometry Laboratory of the University of Missouri. In this frame, a principal research associate will join our team to undertake ceramic petrography analysis and bring together the results of the various techniques employed in order to optimize the characterization of discrete compositional groups and the ascription of production areas. In addition, our team will incorporate a geologist with the aim of exploring possible sources of raw materials in the Levant, Egypt, Crete, and Cyprus, and experimenting with fabric recipes. An aspiring objective of the project will be to address and localize the operation of a long-assumed Cypriot production of Canaanite jar forms through comparative studies of local plain wares. Considering that Canaanite jars and other transport containers were produced and distributed in the name of the commodities they contain, a pivotal task of this new ERC project will be to designate the contents of such vessels from the Cypriot assemblages. These will be addressed by means of advanced organic residue analysis in collaboration with the Organic Geochemistry Unit of the University of Bristol. Resinous residues visible on the interior of several Canaanite jars from Pila-Kouremenos and Gideon Pampula that I have noted so far suggest very promising cases. Our project will further implement highly novel methodologies developed in the field of paleoproteomics for determining the contents of ceramic vessels by extracting and analyzing protein species. These will be done in collaboration with Dr. Elizabeth Briggs and Professor Matthew Collins at the MacDonald Institute at Cambridge University and the University of Copenhagen. The program further aspires to provide a comprehensive chronological scheme for the production and circulation of these vessels. In addition to the compilation of a typochronological sequence of relative chronology produced by morphological and contextual studies, we aspire to anchor the relative series to absolute dates through the implementation of advanced methods for direct dating through compound-specific radiocarbon analysis of organic residues. This is a highly innovative technique employed for the first time on transport containers and will be undertaken under the guidance of Professor Sturt Manning. We anticipate that this task will contribute to discussions on the synchronization of the regional chronological sequences for the period's geographically distinct political entities. Another critical element with regards to maritime transport containers is their volumetric capacity, which in most cases was the only degree of measure employed in the commercial exchanges of the vessel's contents. Capacity estimations for Canaanite jars from the Uluburun shipwreck suggest groupings in a 1:4 ratio, although precise standardization does not appear to have been so straightforward for other contexts. Within the frame of COMPASS, a research associate will employ manual and digital methodologies such as photogrammetry and 3D imaging to provide estimations for the extant vessel's storage capacity. Ultimately, we aim to assess the level of standardization attested within the various classes of maritime transport containers to illuminate the mechanisms involved in their production and exchange. Transport containers constitute a remarkable feat of craftsmanship, and so a critical task will be to disentangle their morpho-functional characteristics. Our project will address the vessel's functional properties that include, among others, the ease of handling, that is, loading and unloading from ships, filling and emptying their contents, etc., Their stackability, that is the ability to efficiently and stably package numerous vessels in the cargo of a ship. The ability to withstand mechanical stress imposed by seaborne travel, and many other aspects. To attain these tasks, a postdoctoral fellow will join our team to undertake an integrated study that includes, first of all, inspections of the morphology of the vessel's individual parts to illuminate their functionality. For example, the level of angularity of the shoulders, the degree of the pointed base, and other elements. Also, the investigation of the forming techniques involved, since at least some of these vessels seem to have been first coil made and then fashioned on the wheel. And this is something that we will investigate in relation to their mechanical qualities through X-ray and CT scans. We will be also assessing the material properties of selected samples based on the examination of thin sections through scanning electron microscopy and mechanical tests to determine the stress and strain profile. In the frame of our project, we will also examine an intrinsic practice involving the marking of singular symbols, or more rarely of very short inscriptions, on transport vessels from Cypriot and other contexts. These pot marks were incised or very rarely painted on prominent areas of the vessel, as a rule after firing. Some of the pot marks are simple and generic, for instance, a cross or an X, but other complex marks have been identified as exclusive signs of contemporary scripts. The practice of marking pottery vessels was especially common in Cyprus, where at least some of the signs appear to belong to the indigenous yet undeciphered Cyprominoan script. Regardless of their association with a formal script, marks convey intentionality and their meaning must be sought. With the contribution of 2 research specialists, our project aspires to shed light on the marking practices involved in the handling of these vessels through the contextual recording of the marked transport vessels from Cyprus and beyond. The corpus of the pot marks recorded by our team will be plotted in relation to other parameters explored in this study, namely their provenance, contents, capacity, and others, to discern patterns. This is a rather ambitious undertaking, but I hope and anticipate that it will lay the foundations for a clearer understanding of the use and meaning of marks, and specifically of the signs of the Cypriot syllabary in the context of seaborne trade, while providing new insights into the marking and coding strategies and the multi-level mechanisms involved in the production, distribution, and consumption of these containers across the Mediterranean. Our final task will follow the fate of these imported jars in Cyprus, having fulfilled the primary mission as shipping containers for seaborne travel. Evidence deriving mostly from later period suggests that, considering the sturdy manufacture, multiple reuse of transport vessels was very common. For instance, it has been suggested that after the consumption of the contents of imported transport containers in Cyprus, some were refilled with new commodities and were redistributed abroad. Empty jars could have also taken on a secondary role as storage vessels alongside Cypriot pithi, or could assume a completely different use. For instance, a Canaanite jar from the late Cypriot settlement at Kalavassos Agios Dimitrios had its top part cut off and was reused as a built-in oven. Our team will also explore the rare phenomenon of infant jar burials in Cyprus, which could signal the presence of people originated from or associated with the Levant, where this mortuary custom is well attested, or could hold symbolic inferences that are certainly worth exploring further. And so to conclude, we anticipate that the implementation of this large-scale and ambitious project integrated traditional archaeological approaches with interdisciplinary methodologies and technological advances, will provide key new data to evaluate the character of interregional maritime trade and intercultural connectivity in the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age. The project will explore the operation of specific networks or regional spheres of commercial interconnections and the different levels of connectivity involved. We will also address the mechanisms involved in the production of maritime transport containers in their respective homelands, with the aim of assessing the potter's choices in relation to the vessel's desired qualities and illuminating the involvement of regional authorities in these processes. Our team will also investigate the marketing strategies involved in the production, distribution, and consumption of maritime transport containers based on the contextual analysis of the marked vessels, and also examine the possibility of specific forms or certain aspects of these vessels functioning as semiotics to communicate provenance, contents, or other elements, what we would call commodity branding in modern economic terms. The project will investigate the impact of imported maritime transport containers on the local societies, exploring the reception of these exotic objects as potential symbols of prestige and high social status, and the significance of the consumption of their contents within social gatherings. The research program will finally address how transformations in the politico-economic sphere can affect aspects of maritime interregional trade, aspire to elucidate how the rise and fall of established institutions can act on the character of interregional trade and intercultural connectivity. And so as this ERC project develops, I hope to be able to present to you the exciting new results undertaken by our research team in a future lecture. In the meantime, I thank you warmly for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Artemis. Fascinating overview of transport containers and maritime trade in the Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze and early Iron Age. One thing is certain: we will need you in a whole series a semester closer to the completion of the project to tell us in more detail about each of these aspects that you just briefly mentioned in your introductory lecture today. Amazing stuff, multi-dimensional research, and so fascinating that you can bring together all these aspects, all these new and informed technologies and approaches to actually shed more light, as you said yourself, on connectivity and maritime trade in particular. Thank you and congratulations and good luck.
Thank you.
Success with the project. It's still early, I know, and you're now into truck. I'm sure there will be, as we have a large audience